It's an honor to actually be, the first group on stage for this year here at Sverige i världen-scenen. Mitt namn är Marika Grisel. I'm a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker. Each seminar is 45 minutes, as you know, most of you. It is live recorded, so it can be seen over the internet. And all of you are very, very welcome. As you walked in, there is an interesting display of photographs. It will be introduced at 5 o'clock this afternoon. But it says Journey to Extremists in Africa. And of course, the topic that we will talk about is violent extremists. It's important to remember that what is that actually? But look at these pictures when you walk out if you can't be here at 5 o'clock. It's a study made by FN's utvecklingsfond UNDP. This seminar is arranged by the Swedish Institute in Alexandria in Egypt. Institute that Peter Weideryd, who is the head of the institute, will talk a little bit more about their role in finding possibilities for dialogue and in understanding. But I will start off by presenting our panel more in detail. Sahara Langi, here next to me. You are from Libya, and you are part of an organization called Libyan Women for Peace. You are an academic. You are a peace activist. You have worked in areas of Islamic studies, sociology, gender equity, and you are residing in Cairo, but are in constant dialogue with your colleagues in Libya. But difficult to go back at the moment because of the violence and the threats that you and your organizations do receive for the work that you're doing. Dr. Ammar El-Shoubaki from Egypt, welcome. You're also an academic and author. You are a columnist in one of the main Egyptian papers. You are also a member of parliament, independent member of parliament, but not allowed to take your seat at the moment. You have written several books about the political system in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt, and also regarding Muslim Brotherhood, jihadism, and the historical part of development of jihadism. Am I correct? Thank you.
Thank you.
Annika Ornbrandt, ambassador at the Swedish Foreign Department, working on issues like European security. You have been working prior to your current position in India and in New York at the UN. And then Peter Weideryd, you are the head of the Swedish Institute in Alexandria. You have a background as a politician. You have worked at the Swedish Church, head of the Swedish Church International Wing. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. My first question would be to you, what or whom is a violent extremist? And I think, Sarah, can you start and just see what is that? Who is a violent extremist?
Well, if we happen to ask ourselves objectively, who is a violent extremist, it doesn't necessarily to be a certain gender, a man or woman of a certain religion, a man or woman of a certain color, a man or woman of a certain belief, any person who tends to express his or her extremist ideas violently. But usually in our today, we tend to see we mix the term violent extremism with radicalism, with terrorism, with jihadism, with a certain particular religion. But that's a lot of presumptions there. And so if we want to address the issue of violent extremism or the motives, because today's talk is about what motivates violent extremism, we need first to define it. And to define it, as I said, objectively in different contexts and contextualize it. And that's how I would start. And to see because it's definitely a problem, to see it in its context. Are there drivers that are not only ideological, that are not only religious oriented, that are political, has to do with grievances, socioeconomic. So there are a lot of things how we can address the issue of violent extremism and what is extremism. Just a quick snap. Whenever there is an attack in Europe, in the West, in our countries, especially in the West, if the attacker is of a certain religion, a certain racial background, then it is a terrorist attack. If this person happens to be white, Western, then it has nothing to do with violent extremism. It has nothing to do with terrorism. It's only a psychological problem. And that's what we're trying to do today, to broaden our discussion on violent extremism and what motivates it.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, Annika.
Fredrika.
Sorry.
It doesn't matter.
I've said that before.
Well, since I came back from New York this morning, where we actually hosted the first high-level conference on counter-terrorism within the UN, we had a discussion with the civil society prior to the meeting. And there is actually no definition on international terrorism. And the same goes for violent extremism. So there is none. But still, we kind of know what it is anyway. And we know what a terrorist crime is. And that, I mean, if you look at the member states of the UN, we have different definitions. But I think key is obviously what Sarah mentioned earlier, is to try to understand who could become a potential terrorist. Could anyone become a terrorist or a violent extremist? And of course, we've seen quite a number of studies and research on this lately, and it seems like there's one common denominator, and that is grievances, as also mentioned by Sarah. A sense of marginalization, actual or perceived marginalization, that kind of leads into a path of radicalization that might in turn lead into terrorist organization or violent extremist organizations.
You would like to continue, Upper? Yes?
Yes.
Please, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we need to compare between what we call the classical jihadi or classical movement in the Arab world in the 70s and 80s, the case of Egypt, Algeria. In Egypt, we had al-Jihad and Jama'ah al-Islamiyya. Al-Jihad, it is a radical and violent group assassinated the president, Egyptian president Sadat in 81. The Algeria in the 90s, Morocco with the Salafi jihadi. All this kind of organization and what we see now with ISIS and the new form of radical group. I think that's what I try to express to understand better what happened now with the new violent group or with the new extremist violent group. First of all the classical group beginning from the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jihad organization and the Jama'ah Islami and all these groups has violent actions. But when I study in the 90s in Egypt, trying to and made interviews with 100 members, 100 ex-members of Jihad in Egypt, who is part of the violent action in the country, attacks the Christian, secular, and we assassinated the president also. All of them mention in this interviews. It was published by our center, Al-Ahram Center. It's an Egyptian think tank. They need from 5 to 7 years to stay with the radical ideology, with the extremist interpretation of the religious text, to be able to go to the act, to the violent act. From 4 to 7 years, the majority of all of this group and the member of Al Jihad and Jama'ah Islamiyah. It was for sure a local organization. It was not globalized like what happened now. So, but we were very impressed to hear that this people need all this time to be able to go to the violent group. So what happened now in Syria and Iraq in Daesh, with Daesh and many terrorist attack in Europe, that you have somebody in 1 month, in 2 months, he's able to be a terrorist, to commit a terrorist attack, and sometimes to be suicidaire, intihari.
Suicide bomber. Suicide bomber.
Yeah. And this experience not we don't have in the 70s and the 80s all the terrorist attack in the region. It was attack, not suicidaire attack. So I think the different, it's the relation now with the ideology, with the religious text. What I think that the shift from, and I prefer to read this paragraph and I finish. The shift from doctrinal to vindictive, violent, don't mean the total absent of religious factor in new form of violence. It rather means that instead of the religious text being the point of departure based on which any violent action, it became instead the tool only through which the action is endowed with legitimacy. That's what happened for a social and sectarian, the case in Iraq, and maybe a racist, marginalized, social problem, political issue. This person became ready to be a terrorist, and to justify his act, he researched a religious or pretext to justify his violent acts. That's, I think, it's completely different what we had in the 70s and the 80s, that we had a real ideological movement in this time.
So you do the comparison looking back into the history, saying that at that time the radicals used years to convince themselves of using violence. And today it has become a much shorter period, whether it is justified with religion or not. And of course, we know it could be not just religion by leaders who are saying they belong to a certain Middle East religion, like it could be Christian or it could be Islam, but you use the religion as a substitute or a tool to justify a terrorist act.
Yeah, it means they are another factor.
Yeah, a tool for a terrorist act. Peter, the first question was, who is a violent extremist? You can please be a little brief, and then also tell us why you think this is so important that we're standing here talking about this today.
I'll try to be very brief. A violent extremist is a criminal and should be treated as a criminal and should take individual responsibility as a criminal and should be charged with police and legal matters as a criminal. They can, as you say, use different motives and arguments that can be made from political perspective or from religious perspective, but basically it is a criminal. And there is no pattern that I have seen working in the Middle East many years and also with these issues in Europe that you can find a certain stream in Islam or anywhere else where you have more motives. It is a criminal activity and should be treated as that. And of course, it's important for us to understand so there is no misperception that a certain religion is more violent than the others, or that we have wrong understanding of what brings these motives. Because if we have the wrong understanding, there is a risk that we use the wrong methods of fighting it and counteract it.
Let us say a little bit about the motives then. Sometimes when we look at criminal activity, you mentioned grievance, but if we look at criminal activity, for example, often said, follow the money. You look at corruption issues, you look at other criminal activities, follow the money. Where does the money trail come into this, Zahra?
Well, first, I wanted to jump and comment on Peter. Yes, it's criminal, but then who are we going to define as a violent extremist? And again, I use always the example, whoever bombs a cafe or go and shoot his schoolmates, is he considered or she considered a violent extremist because they have done a crime? This is a crime. Or are we looking into their background, and if they tend to be of a certain religion, or if even they are religious, and here we need to see, are people triggered by their religion, whatever that religion is? Does religion only trigger violence, or can secular ideologies, and we've seen in different historical contexts that certain secular, by that I mean that has nothing to do with religion, triggers and motivates violence. So yes.
Like what kind of
for example, and I will give an example, and to bring it back to our own context. I'm from Libya. And there we have militias. They are some of them are criminal militias, and they were funded, as to bring it back to your question. There was money business into it, but then they were given an ideology, a religious ideology. But if we look into the background of these certain radical political Islamist movements in our region, to give like an example of Al-Qaeda, is the background only religious? Can we only say that this has been, this is the product of Islamic history? When we look into their background, they are not religiously educated people. They're people who are suffering from loss of identities in the global context, in the globalization context. There are grievances. Again, if we look into and many of the thinkers of these movements like Sayyid al-Qutb, who is one of the early founders of the Muslim Brotherhood political movement, was influenced by Mussolini. The founder of Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, in the early 20s, was fond in his memoirs by Hitler. So can we, and the rise of the caliphate, the whole idea of bringing back a golden age, does it remind us of certain groups in a different context, the fascist movement? For example, Mussolini calling for the resurgence of the Roman Empire, Hitler calling for the resurgence of ancient Rome, except in a German context. So there are certain ideologies that not necessarily religious, and we have them like the radical pan-Arabists at a certain point, like Saddam Hussein, who comes from the Ba'athist party. He's a radical too. He's a violent extremist too. Not necessarily religious, not religious at all. He actually fought the political Islamists. So we need to redefine our terms. And it's all about power. And we develop a discourse that uses tools. It weaponizes the religious texts. It could weaponizes also our historical memory.
I think you bring up a very important point. You know, we have to go back into history to understand what's going at the moment, but that's often very difficult. Fredrika, I'll let you continue in a moment. But if we then look at what motivates them, so you have a leadership that uses ideology, religion or other kinds of ideology historically, but then you have followers who might have grievances or might live in socioeconomic despair and would like to become part of a movement for different reasons. It could be that they gain economically from it, or they gain some kind of power, or they get hold of a weapon, which means that they can plunder. Fredrika, I know that you were waving your hand, but why is it important that we look back into the history as well then, when you hear our guests talking together with you?
No, I think it's important to keep in mind also that we're still talking about a limited number of people. I mean, if you go back in history and look at the 70s and the 80s, actually IRA was more deadlier than Daesh. I think that's important to keep in mind while having this discussion. But I also believe that Peter is absolutely right. Of course, if you have committed a terrorist crime, they're a criminal. That's obvious. But what we need to do then is to find and prosecute, find the evidence. And that's actually what the international debate is all around today. We're talking about exchange of information, databases, DNA, biometrics, stricter border controls, etc., etc. So just I'll go back to history. I just want to stress this. I mean, it's a lot of focus on this. That's we're not lacking ideas in that area. What we need to understand, and here we might have to go back to history, is what motivates and drives these people into radicalization that might lead to terrorism. Because radicalization in itself is not illegal. It's when you commit a crime. That's also very important to understand and keep in mind. And when you look at the drivers, a couple of years ago, like the UNDP organization within the UN, I know they had a big conference and they were thinking about maybe it's mainly about economic drivers, because you could see that when you were offered money and you didn't have that much resources, that could be one driver to get into to violent extremist organizations. But that is not always correct. Because sometimes if you look in Bangladesh, for example, and the attacks we had there a couple of years ago, it was the upper middle class that committed the crimes. So the need for an income is not sufficient. But it's still there for some people. For other people, it's a matter of security. Because they have so many terrorist attacks and they are constantly living under a threat that belonging to one of the violent extremist organizations is actually a way to protect yourself. I mean, it sounds strange, but for some people, security is key. For other people, it's a sense of belonging which might be a little bit strange as well. I mean, you find your identity among these people. And they tend to confirm each other. So it's a very complex set of drivers that we need to look at. And they differ depending on not only the country, but also the local circumstances. So we have to understand what the drivers are to be able to meet radicalization that might lead into terrorism in order to stop our overall terrorist threat.
So when I listen to you now, and I think you might agree, it's a complex issue. There are no quick fixes here. And yet, people tend to simplify these issues. And we're talking about motivation. Peter, you were waving your arm.
Yeah.
What happens if we do not understand and take in consideration the complex situation that are driving extremists, violent extremists, all around the world, actually? You can maybe bring it back to a place like Sweden, or between different countries in Europe, or between our dialogue between the Middle East and Europe. Why is it so important?
No, because if we have the wrong analysis and the wrong understanding, we might apply the wrong recipe to cure the problem. I had my first personal encounter with ISIS, Daesh, in September 2013. They had a car bomb in Erbil in Iraq, where I was working at that time. And then they tried to enter into and kill the head of security, the Peshmerga office. I heard the shooting, I heard the bomb, and it was just a few blocks from my office, so I went there to try to understand what was going on. And then I was told that this was ISIS. ISIS, I said, what is ISIS? I'd not heard of them before. It was totally new to me. I'd worked in Iraq for 3 years. 8 months later, they took Mosul. So they went from nothing to this very powerful position within 8 months. And how could they do that? Yeah, the only answer I could find was that they had the help of the old military structure and the Ba'ath Party structure, the old military structure of Saddam Hussein. These were not religious people. These were very secular people, but they were enormously motivated to come back to power, to come back to dignity. They had been mistreated so heavily after the invasion of Iraq 2003 that they basically provided the space for that kind of radicalization. So if we don't understand that and apply the wrong kind of medicine, we can go into deeper problems. And that is, of course, also that we have to be careful in Sweden now. We have an election year. We have a growing intolerance also in our own society, not least to Muslims. I followed with some interest the discussion on the minaret in Växjö, for example, which is a second minaret in Sweden who is meant to call for prayer. The first one is in Fittja in Stockholm. And the police, of course, who gave that permission, purely based it on the legal situation in Sweden. When a mosque is asking for a permission, they have to give the permission, because that's according to the European Convention of Human Rights. But the political structure find it very difficult and immediately start to react. The mayor in Växjö, 2 party leaders, go up and say that this is not possible because they link it wrongly to radicalization. So this growing intolerance will, of course, create more polarization in society, will create more difficulties. So if we don't talk to each other, if we don't understand, if we don't meet each other, we will actually increase a problem instead of solving them.
So, what can then be done, considering that we do see an increased polarization in terms of us pointing finger towards different groups when it comes to extremist violence or violent extremists? Those who are victims come from all spheres of life. There is nobody who is not, nobody is protected in that sense. Have we completely failed of understanding how the grievance of people or ideology, the way it feeds into people's need of belonging? What is it? 2018, why are we standing with this enormous problem? You said power. People want power. Where do you see hope? Where do you think we can act if we're interested in dialogue, finding sustainable peace in many parts of the world, including Europe.
I think that comes with investing more in our shared humanity, investing more in charity, in service, regardless of your background, whether it's secular, it's religious, is to fight the hate speech, is to fight intolerance, is to work on what is common between us. And I always think there is hope. But then we need to be more inclusive, more integrating. And I think like we did today when we packed violent extremism and we found that it's a complex phenomena, it also needs a complex solution, not a quick fix, as you were saying. And by complex, it means it's a comprehensive, holistic, integrated approach that not only focuses on criminalizing, yes, we agree on that, on securitized approach, but we need to think on bringing other approaches, integration, development. And I will end with this. I remember 3 or 4 years, and I've brought this example before, because for me it's so telling. I was meeting with one of the Western ministers on education and equal opportunities, and she was telling me, okay, I need you to come to my country, and because we have a lot of violent extremism and people are joining Daesh, and maybe you should talk to the imams in our country and tell them that they should be more moderate and blah, 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 and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, maybe if you focus more on your own field, education and equal opportunity, you can help your community more than I can help them.
Thank you, Sarah. We will come back. Yes, please, continue.
Yeah, maybe I would like, before, just to add something concerning the Iraq, because it's very relevant to what Peter mentioned. I think sometimes our reaction, we said the problem is only the problem of interpretation of religious text or Islam text, and sometimes we said the problem is only with the organization of Daesh, every day by the media, the organization and Islam. I think Daesh now, it's really not a real organization. The real threat, it's incubating environment, the context, the political and social context. It's the first time in the history of Arab world that terrorist group like Daesh occupied cities like Mosul and before in Syria, Raqqa. What happened? How we liberated this city? When the political context start to change in Iraq with a new government, less sectarian, because many of Sunnah in Iraq consider the ex-government as an extremist government, taking the Sunni as a target. So they tolerated Daesh, and they accept Daesh to control big cities. When the political context change in Iraq with a new government, all these Sunni, all these people who supported Daesh start to be against completely and accept the national army to enter and to liberate these cities. So I think one of our challenges, it's Daesh, it's a context. It's not really an organization. If we fight every day against the organization, yes, it's good. We liberated and this organization with defeat in Iraq, in Syria. But the individual, what's about after the post-Daesh? What's about the social context? I think we and political context and the sectarian issue and the globalization. What we need, how to we have incubating environment who able to product Daesh or new form of Daesh. We have a social and political and sectarian context. We have in Egypt is a problem of political revanches. We have the discourse of victimization of many people in Sinai, by example. So I think we need to focus more about the social and political and sectarian and the state of our institution, and to understand and to fight against Daesh. But if we reduce the case in religious text, and religious some bad interpretation of religious text, I think we will not move because if we have this text exist from more than 1,400 years, why in this specific context we have the kamikaze reaction? I mentioned we had a terrorist in the 70s, in the 60s we have a terrorist attack, never suicidaire. Never we had this kind of people who don't want to stay alive, and they decide to kill in 3 weeks. I cannot understand that there are a text in 3 weeks able to make this terrorist attack without analyzing the context, the context, social context, the political context, the sectarian problems, who motivated these people to go to the act. And when he go to the act, he justified his act by we have a religious text, so it's okay. I will go to the paradis.
I think,
paradis, comme on dit, paradis.
I think for many of us, it is really I mean, just the fact that people can do these kind of acts that we have seen is absolutely terrifying, and that's what I mean. We have really. There is a problem in leadership. There is a problem in the way the international community reacted. It took a very long time to understand what was the driving force also and the kind of acts that were committed. But the question was now, we only have a few minutes left, is where do you see hope? And let me ask Fredrika and then maybe we can go back before we stop. Where do you see hope? Because, I mean, there is obviously a problem in the international community and with leadership in these issues.
Yeah, we know more today than before. We know that 71%, and this is from UNDP, actually went to terrorist organization or joint terrorist organization because of over-violence from police and the military. We know that it's very important to respect human rights and the rule of law, because disrespect might create grievances. We also know that many young people radicalize into violent extremist organizations, and we are also aware, and I think the global discussion and the international discussion today is a little bit different compared to just a few years back. We need to create jobs, we need to give them proper education, and we need to engage and make young people participate, because young people are normally the ones that are drawn to violent extremism for various reasons. So my firm belief is that together, since we have more knowledge today, and the international discussion is different, this will actually contribute to a better world for youth, but also for us as adults. So I believe in a more prosperous future, and that's what we need also in order to avoid radicalization leading to terrorism.
So, I mean, the fact that we have more research, you are contributing to that through your work, that there is a global discussion going on, that you have it on your table as ambassador in Sweden is also, of course, an encouraging sign that we take these issues really seriously.
Yeah, and you can see young people really engaging.
Yes.
They engaged at the UN, and I know that they do that throughout the world. And it's just so important, because then young people also get a sense of belonging and being able to have an impact on decision making in the world today.
We will, of course, also try. On Tuesday, the Swedish Institute in Alexandria is also hosting another seminar about the vicious circle of polarization, which is, of course, part of this, you know, when we point finger and become more and more polarized in our worldview. And, of course, we have a few politicians in the world who are driving that as well, with a very simplification of the challenges that we are facing in the world today. But if I just want to come back to you, Peter, and maybe let you partly finish, and I come back to Sarah as well. But, you know, the Institute in Alexandria has on its table to discuss and provide for dialogue. Do you see, when you look into the present situation, that there is an interest to meet in different countries, between groups, and talking about the issues that are at stake, and also between Europe and the Middle East?
Yes, it's complex, and it's both hopeful and disturbing at the same time. When this institute was formed 20 years ago, it was with the understanding of having Middle East to better understand Europe, and Europe better to understand the Middle East. Today we are in a situation where I see less of a problem of clash between civilization, but more of a problem of clash within civilization. Because both in the Middle East and in Europe, you have a growing tolerance and curiosity to the other, but also the opposite, a growing intolerance, polarization, populism, protectionism. Both are growing. The difference is that Europe has stronger institutions that helps us to protect us from ourselves, like international cooperation, like the European Union, human rights mechanism, freedom of press, etc., that you don't have in the Middle East. So in the Middle East, this polarization immediately go into violence. But Christians are not better than Muslims, and Europeans are not better than Arabs on this. We are the same people, and it is a very similar problem we are fighting with. I see more hope with women than with men. Women are more open-minded. I see more hope with young people than with old people. They are more open-minded. I see more hope with urban people than with rural people, and more hope with educated than uneducated. More hope on the minorities and with majorities. So it is complex, and we have to understand that complexity and provide space both to bring people that would like to have dialogue, to understand each other better, to be advocate for it, but also to bring people that don't want to meet. We need also to talk with the difficult people.
We have 2 minutes left, so it is from there to there, 2 words that gives you hope. And I think you have been here today, of course, it's a complex issue. You have been given a lot of food for thoughts, I think. You might have come here to think that now we will know what motivates extremists. Well, that is not a simple question. But let us talk about what gives you hope, and then we end, and then a big applaud to our panelists. So Fredrika, you were first out.
Young people. Is that 2 words?
That's young people. Great. So you know. And for you?
I am optimistic, and I think we can fight extremists in Europe and in the Arab world, and we will win.
Good.
Not only in the football for this.
Thank you.
I would say women then, or more female perspective.
Thank you. Also another seminar that's coming up on Wednesday. Yes. Use the microphone.
Yeah, he said already one of the things I want like to see, the feminine perspective. The other thing I would say is re-questioning always our dogmas. I think this is where we start, and to think holistically. And this comes with a feminine or a feminist perspective.
And re-questioning our dogmas is something we do constantly here in Almedalen, I hope. It's just the very first seminar at Sverige in the world, you know, Sweden in the world. We do live in a global context. Nothing is insulated in a small little cubicle. We belong together and we need to solve these problems together. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will come back for the next seminars of this week coming. Thank you.